like to apologize for the disruption, and I think we will continue. I believe Matt was telling us how he and David have known each other for a long time and had wanted to collaborate and didn't quite know on what. And then you were at the British Museum and
yeah, so we'll try to continue. That was exciting. So I was at the British Museum in early 2019, and they were putting on an exhibition called Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms, which was talking about the early medieval English world and how it was interconnected across Europe and across the rest of the world. And I went through the exhibition. It was really beautiful. It was really exceptional. Lots of glittering gold reliquaries and beautifully illuminated manuscripts and other sorts of everyday objects that were really finely made and just filled with kind of really beautiful things, but also really importantly, kind of descriptions about how those things were made and how they were taken from materials not just from England but from all across Europe and even beyond there. And as these things do, they kind of, these exhibitions do, they kind of shuffle you into the gift shop afterwards. And, I was kind of looking around, maybe thinking about buying a keychain or something like that. And because it was the British Library, they had a whole host of books there as well, not just kind of exhibition catalogs, but also kind of books about the medieval European Middle Ages as a whole. And the books on early medieval England were excellent. A lot of them were from very recent publication dates, full of kind of information about the world of early medieval England. But the general histories of the European Middle Ages as a whole, they were older, and they trafficked in this idea of the Dark Ages, and more importantly, they didn't seem to match what I had just seen in the exhibition. That they were talking about the Middle Ages almost exclusively as an age of barbarity, as an age without learning, like a very simplistic picture of 1,000 years that stretches across at least 2 to 3 continents. And so I remember this very clearly. I was standing again in the gift shop, and I pulled out my phone right there, and I texted David, and I said, David, we need to write a book on the European Middle Ages, and we should call it.
I said we should call it the Bright Ages. I remember getting the message, and it was just like that. I had this title in my head for a long time, but I didn't know what it was a title to, right? I didn't know. I just knew as every medievalist who I know is aware that there is this, all historians, there's a disconnect between the popular understanding of their field and the thing they actually study. But I would submit to you that the gap between the Dark Ages, which has such power as a phrase in our culture and is in many ways really 700 years old, dating back to Petrarch in the late 14th century, and the thing that we actually study is particularly acute. And it's acute both in terms of the difference between what we know and this narrative, but also the power of the narrative in terms of how people talk about it today, how people imagine themselves, how people imagine time. It's tied into a lot of very sort of deeply problematic conceptions of the past, whether we're talking about 19th century nationalism or 20th century race science or 21st century white supremacy. There's this idea of barbarity in the Dark Ages that is tied up in this, but also it's just not true. And so we started, and I'm just going to read like 2 sentences, and then we'll get to the conversation. A few weeks after that, or maybe a month after that, Matt and I had the book going, and we were trying to write an introduction. And I went to Virginia Tech, and as happens in Minnesota, there was a blizzard that was threatening to keep me from getting home again. And so I had to leave at 4:30 in the morning. I got in a rental car and drove from Blacksburg, Virginia, across the Appalachian Mountains to Charlotte, North Carolina, to catch an early flight home. And as I was driving across the mountains, I spoke into my phone. And I remember speaking a sentence that was more or less the first one in the book, which is, our story begins on the east coast of Italy on a sunny day sometime around the year 430 CE, when artisans entered a small chapel and turned the sky blue. And they were talking about this mausoleum, the sacred space of Galla Placidia, the small chapel, because we wanted to begin from the very first minute, right? A story has to begin somewhere. And there are lots of places you could you could choose to talk about. We wanted to begin with this moment of generation, of creation, and also to talk about how this period is knowable, right? When we're talking about brightness, we're not talking about that everything was great and pretty, although we do talk about pretty things, but that it's knowable, it's understandable. And a later example in the book is we talk about the creation of Sainte-Chapelle, perhaps the most beautiful object of Gothic art, or building of Gothic art from medieval Europe, the stunning place in Paris. I hope everyone here has gotten to see it or gets to see it. These windows soaring up to the sky, the light passing through, and that's bright. But right when Sainte-Chapelle was being built and then brought into use, we also might have seen brightness from the burning of the Talmud, when the same king who built this building burned Jewish books of law. There's brightness there too. So one thing what's really important to us is that we are talking about something that is knowable and human and messy and contains beauty, but also contains horror because it contains humans. I think we'll leave it there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think the way that we're going to proceed is I will ask David and Matt questions for a while, but we'll soon open it up to questions in general. I know that actually we can't go much after 6 because David has another engagement. So so if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I will convey them. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the process of collaboration. I mean, you went to Virginia Tech early on, but the commitment to collaborate was sealed on that phone call when you had the title, right?
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about the process of collaborating.
For sure. My graduate advisor is on this meeting. And one thing I like to say is I didn't learn how to collaborate in grad school because it's not how historians are trained. And maybe that's okay. But in terms of writing together, right, that's not how we're trained. And so Matt and I, we wrote an essay together and we liked it. I actually remember sitting on my couch in my pajamas with a Google Doc open between us, writing this short little essay for the Washington Post. And we liked that. That was on our mind when we agreed to write this book together. But we didn't know what it meant to write a book together. We had no models. We had no practice, as opposed to writing a book by ourselves, which we are trained how to do in grad school. That's a big part of what grad school is. So I want to be very clear, this isn't a criticism of my graduate education, but it was new to us. And so we came up with a plan, which was that I would go to Blacksburg, we would write together. Matt would come to Minnesota, we'd write together, we'd go back and forth, we'd write independently, we'd share documents, but we'd spend a good chunk of time in each other's company trying to write together. And that happened once. That happened once. In the fall of 2019, Matt came to visit me. We rented a cabin up north of Brainerd. We went fishing. We wrote a couple chapters. It was great. And then we were going to do it again in the spring of 2020, and everyone here knows what happened. And we think it's important that we wrote this book during a global pandemic. We think the fact that we wrote this over cloud documents that we wrote, I think in some ways it made the collaborative process different. I think it made it stronger, or it made it strong in a way that I really like about the book. But also it changed who we are, and that we were writing it, while in various stages of isolation and fear and resignation and hope, and then fear again, right? Everything that we've all been through. That's the world in which we wrote the book, and that shows up in the book. So we came up with chapters. And our process was this: one of us would draft a chapter because someone has to write the words first. We tried to not overthink the drafting of the chapter, and if it was things like 200 words on the military history of the First Crusade here, we might just write that and then come back to it later and leave it there. And then we would send it to the other person, and the other person would treat it as their draft and just write on top of it. And I think that's the thing that we like to emphasize. It was not David's draft and then Matt put in comments or suggestions or track changes. We did not track changes. We deliberately did not track changes so that the prose would become ours. And while I remember writing the first draft of that first sentence, that's because I was driving before dawn across the mountains. It was very dramatic. I don't
Mhm.
remember how it got revised. And I don't
Mhm.
remember, and there are lots of sentences in this book, sentences that I love, that I'm really proud to have written, that I don't actually know if I wrote in any meaningful way. I don't know if I wrote the first one or the second one or the 10th one, because by the time we got through this smoothing process of just writing on top of each other's words, it really became our prose. And then we could work it. And that's when the track changes and the footnotes and everything else came in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add to that too is that, David's absolutely right. And I 100% agree that, we're just not trained for this. But I think the thing that happened as we were working on this, as we got into kind of the meat of, the book itself, really deep into, several chapters or something like that, is we realized like, we do as historians work collaboratively generally. It's just that collaboration isn't made as transparent as it is when you're co-authoring. And what I mean is that if you're doing scholarship, you're working with archivists, you're talking with other colleagues at conferences, or sometimes over email. And the pandemic really brought that into stark relief, because we were oftentimes working without our academic libraries at our home institutions, because those were closed, because we couldn't go anywhere. So it became a matter of kind of going on Twitter or sending emails to colleagues like, hey, does anybody have this PDF, this article? Does anybody have a copy of this book? I seem to remember this in there. Can you look at this? And we were surrounded by a community of scholars who were willing to help us, and who really brought that into stark relief. And then the only other thing I'll add to that is, and I think that's true kind of generally, and we need to, as historians, as humanists, kind of, be a little bit better about talking with that generally. The only other thing I'll add too is that one of the things that was really amazing during this process is the level of trust that David and I kind of had to establish as we were writing. I don't like anyone, even when I think it's a final draft, reading my stuff. So like being vulnerable enough to send a first draft to someone is really something. Like, I mean, I think, I would love for someone to give me a medal for that. And I think that's true of any of us, right? Is that, we are always kind of constantly revising. We're thinking about a better way to, express something, or maybe another article or book that we could read, just to make sure that we're on the right page. And so, but we got to the stage where it was indeed like we would put some words on a page, and I would send it to David and said, David, make this better. And he did. And David would do the same thing to me. And I think that's why we're really happy that the book is ours at the end of the day, that, that there are individual sentences, as David said, that are absolutely his or absolutely mine. But at the end, but the vast majority of words that are in that page, of the 90,000 plus that are there, like we have no idea kind of how they came exactly to be, other than through some sort of collaboration.
Yeah, except for the really bad jokes, those are all Matt's.
Those are
clear that if you find really bad jokes, they're Matt's.
Yes.
You own the bad jokes, man.
I own, yes, the bad dad jokes. Yes, 100% me. Yes.
Okay, well, it's good that we cleared that up. Well, I mean, in terms of the collaborative process, this is very different than the work you've done before, but also in terms of the audience that you were thinking of, it's very different. And I guess I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about how what you learned about the Bright Ages from writing this book. I mean, how did the writing of the book shape your impressions of your field?
Sure. No, absolutely. So I think that's one of the really, I think really one of the exciting things about the process of writing it, and seeing people kind of read it now too, is the little things that they get excited about, the things they didn't know. I saw a tweet today somebody was really excited that Charlemagne, and this great emperor in the 9th century, he had an elephant sent to him by the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, and that elephant had a name, and we know the name of the elephant. It was a balubas. Like, people didn't know that. They were really excited that we can know something about this elephant that traveled across North Africa, across the Alps, all the way to what's now northern Germany. So there's those kind of little things. But about kind of generally about audience, I think too, is that one of the things that I think really helped us, as we were kind of keeping in mind that we're not writing for specialists, we're writing for kind of a general population, people who kind of know what the Middle Ages, the European Middle Ages are, but maybe aren't familiar with the contours, and certainly aren't familiar with kind of the most current scholarship about it. Is the thing that really helped us is the fact that we're both teachers. We both care very deeply about teaching. And so in like an introductory level course, is you really can't take a whole lot for granted. You know, and I remember very distinctly, like my first year in my position here at Virginia Tech, like talking about the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, which you know existed from the 4th until the 15th century, and a couple students in the front row had such blank faces that it was clear they had no idea what I was talking about, and I was just assuming way too much knowledge. And so just being able to step back from what I know, and then even back beyond that to like, how would I talk to, you know, my parents, for example, or, you know, my teenage son, and how would I explain this to them, really helped us. And it didn't like perfect it, you know, because we had to kind of massage it from there. But again, like just not taking too much for granted, I think really helped us think about the way that we were talking about things and made sure that we were explaining things as clearly as possible.
Well, and did that necessity bring you any new insights?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I think one of the amazing things is like as a medievalist, right, is like you cover 1,000 years of history or more across, you know, a continent at least, if not more. And you know, so one of the great things was learning consistently, you know, about these things. One of the things, you know, and I was actually talking with some students about this just the other day here at Virginia Tech, the chapter on the Black Death, right, about the pandemic, you know, particularly in the front of everyone's mind, obviously with the global pandemic that's going on right now. But I realized I had been lying to my students for a long time, that my lecture on the Black Death in my intro course was just wrong, because it was fundamentally outdated. And during the course of the Bright Ages, just spending some time learning about the amazing interdisciplinary advances that have been done, work with genetics, work with environmental history that has really, and archaeological sites that has really revolutionized the way that we talk about the Black Death, what it was, how it spread, what its impact was, and things like that, was absolutely kind of mind-boggling. And we tried to, you know, capture that wonder, that excitement of discovery in that particular chapter, for example.
And I would add to that, you know, I think we learned that you can tell this story in this way of emphasizing knowability and connection and do it in a way that isn't sort of, you know, sort of recuperative, trying to say, oh, everything was great in the Middle Ages. People in the Middle Ages were so happy. It was all right. You can tell that you can do honest historical work, but in this way that makes just a different set of choices than before. And again, you know, I've been thinking about this a long time. We've been doing it I think a lot of us have been doing it in our teaching in different kinds of contexts, but to sit down and write it. And then the sort of the 10,000 choices and figuring, often the learning came in figuring out what a chapter was about. And I'll just give two quick examples. One of them is the chapter on Maimonides. And we really wanted to write about Maimonides, but I think the first sense was we wanted to write about Maimonides because he was important. And he was important is not actually a good thesis for a chapter. And I would say the early drafts of the chapters weren't strong. What that chapter is about the movement of ideas back and forth in a pretty short period of time, from Iran to Egypt to Iberia to Italy and around the Mediterranean and back to Central Asia, to show that ideas move, that they move fast, relatively fast in this bright age, in this period, and to use Maimonides as the center of that. That's what that chapter is about. Or the chapter on early Islam, right? I mean, early Islam is one of the great stories in world history. And there are many great stories, but certainly it is a profound and fascinating and dramatic story, and it happens fast, and then the world looks very different. And it's a story that's been told a lot by a lot of people and a lot of great books, some of which we had read before and some of which we read for this. Our chapter on early Islam is to point out that Islam is a medieval European religion, not only medieval European, but that there is no moment by about 700 in which there aren't Muslims who are Europeans, and that continues. And that's what so it was less about discovering new facts, although that happened all the time too, just by reading different articles, but more about finding different ways to tell stories and different ways to figure that kind of thing out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is important is not it's not a compelling thesis. I mean,
It's not, yeah.
I mean, it may be a good starting point, but no, I really like those examples. Do you have plans for future collaboration?
We have about 10 different book titles flying back and forth, plus a deep sense of exhaustion at the same time. But we absolutely are we're talking about the Bright Ages descended upon us, right? In that, I mean, that opening anecdote, it's a good story, but it's true. It descended upon us. It's a different kind of process to think about now, and it descended upon us, and we didn't know, like, would an agent want it? If an agent wanted it, would a publisher want it? If a publisher wanted it, would people read it, right? So
yeah.
Now we know that's possible, but it's a very different kind of moment to think about what might come next.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's up. I mean, like we were not arguing, but discussing kind of earlier today, kind of what that next project is. And, we have kind of a shared Google Drive that has not a whole lot in it. But, we keep sending kind of vague potential titles, back and forth from now. I think that, the thing that kind of unites all the ideas, and I don't want to, David, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, is that, we're deeply committed to the idea of, like, how do people know about the past? And that could be in the medieval world or in the modern world as well, is to think about, like, how does the past shape the lived experiences of people, both either living in the medieval world themselves or living in contemporary America or beyond. And so thinking about, like, how do we explain that, and how do we convey to people that why the study of the past is really important and why it matters. So I think that's kind of the thread that we're toying around, and we're kind of revolving around a general idea, but we just haven't settled there. We're hoping for lightning to strike like it did before, and we'll let people know as soon as it does.
Keep going to museum bookstores and find.
I should, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, I mean, this book has been extremely well received, and I won't ask you how many copies it sold. That's a crass question. If you want to tell me, you can. But have there been things about the reception that surprised you? I mean, other than, yeah. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I have to tell you that nothing prepared me to watch people live tweeting reading my book. Now, it's not as fast as a TV show, but it is a book you can read, and you can read it with some pace. You can certainly read a chapter each chapter is sort of 3,500 to 5,000 words maybe. And people do. And I have to tell you that my bookshelf, some of which are behind me, but I'm not going to say which one, is filled with books that I bought because they looked interesting and I haven't read. And sometimes I haven't read them because I own them like a scholar, which is to say I need it on my shelf so I can find the thing I want to find in it. And that's how I expect my first book has mostly been engaged too. But other times I bought it because it felt like a thing I wanted to buy, but then I didn't sit down and just read it all the way through. Yeah. And surely that's true for the Bright Ages, but not for everyone. And I know that because beyond the formal reviews and media, people in this era of social media and Zoom conversation, people live tweeted reading it chapter after chapter. And that was really extraordinary. The other thing is this book came out right before Christmas, which meant that people gave it to people. And seeing people give it to their 15-year-olds and their 90-year-olds, right? I mean, that was again not something I was emotionally prepared for, and I'm just really grateful. I guess the question is for me sort of then what comes next as people read it. What's the next book that takes the Bright Ages and either tries to do a Bright Ages kind of reread of something else? When you write a book proposal of the sort that we wrote, you have to, and this is true actually to some extent for scholarly monographs, but much more so in this context, you have to talk about the market. You have to talk about what are the comparable books out there that are selling really well, but are not the same book. So you have to both say there's an emptiness and an opportunity. And hopefully you have an agent who helps you do this. It's not like it's also something we were not trained to do in grad school, nor should we be, but we had it right. So what are the proposals out there that now list the Bright Ages, and that are not medieval Europe or not medieval European history? And I think that's really, I'm excited about that. I know, for example, one of the things that we absolutely did not talk about is music. We talk about art. We talk about lots of genres and lots of we do not talk about music. And I know a medieval musicologist who said, I love your book. I want to do a Bright Ages about medieval music. And I hope she does, because I don't know it. I mean, I genuinely don't. I'm a musician, but my ideas about medieval music are probably wrong, probably entirely wrong. And so I'm excited for that kind of next project, both about the subjects I know something about, but then also people taking this sort of approach to other eras and other places.
Well, I have a comment and a question from your PhD advisor.
I'm going to let Matt take it.
Well, I don't think his PhD advisor said the suggestion is, since you are both Crusades historians, why don't you write a collaborative history of the Crusades? You don't have to answer that now. The Kay's other question is, how did you decide what to include? And what she says, there have been updates of Survey Classics. Judith Bennett's updating of Warren Hollister with women inserted into medieval history. Did you integrate new agenda topics, and how did you do that?
Yeah, so to Kay's first question, we have absolutely talked about that. So that's not off the table. So one of the problems with Crusade histories, at least I think is just there's so many histories of the Crusades. There's so many popular histories of the Crusades. I just struggling to find kind of what new could be said. And I think there's probably some new things to be said, but we just haven't figured out exactly what that might be. So as far as kind of the second question, like how did we include, decide what to include? I would say, there's thousands of words that we wrote that didn't make it in there. And there's a couple thousand in particular that David kind of hates me for, insisting that we didn't include, and he can maybe talk about that later. But I think one of the things that we wanted to do as we were thinking about how to structure the book, and again, like it went through many iterations. Like there was the proposal version which did X, Y, and Z, and then there was kind of the first draft which added a couple other things, and then there was a final version which settled on some other things. But one of the things I think we knew from the very outset is we wanted to hit kind of, we wanted to do a little bit of a grand tour, in the sense that we wanted to include the things that are really familiar to people when they think about the European Middle Ages. So, we wanted to talk about this idea of the fall of Rome. We wanted to make sure that we talked about kind of the Carolingians, this idea of empire. We wanted to make sure we talked about the Crusades. We wanted to make sure we talked about the Vikings. We wanted to make sure that we talked about the Black Death. And we wanted to make sure that we talked about the so-called Renaissance and how you kind of end the Middle Ages and kind of moving out. And then, there's some kind of, the stuff in between. That was where the negotiation was. But within all of that, as well as kind of the other chapters that we ended up deciding, is that we didn't want to recapitulate the way that medieval history has oftentimes been told, which is great white men doing great white things, right? And the reason we didn't want to do that is because although it seems that's the world that's portrayed by the sources, it's actually not. And I think the advances and the amazing scholarship that's been done by our colleagues, in doing medieval studies across the last 50 years or so or more, is to show that that women are part of the picture, that people outside of Europe or people who aren't white are part of the story. And so we wanted to make sure that we included that narrative as well, right? And so, for example, like when we talk about I'm kind of primarily an early medievalist, so I focus on stuff kind of before the year 1000, or certainly before 1100. That's all modern history in the 12th century. But when we were talking about when we wrote the chapter on the Carolingians, right, this great empire that was recreated by Charlemagne, this resurrection of the Roman Empire, or his conceptualization, the resurrection of the Roman Empire with quotes around it. At the end of Empire, there's a woman by the name of Duoda, who is a noble woman who writes this manual for her son. This basically a long letter, kind of a handbook for her son, and the letter survives. Like, we have the text. We don't know a ton about Duoda except for the manuscript itself and some other kind of scattered references, but we can know kind of who she is by thinking about what this text is, what it does. And she was a deeply learned theological thinker, but also a philosopher, a political analyst, and among many other things. And so we needed to make sure that we included that story, as well as kind of Charlemagne as an emperor building, conquering peoples and building legal and administrative structures as well. That's there, but so is Duoda, and I think that's true across all of the chapters that we told, is we wanted to make sure that you have a fuller sense, as full as it could be across like 3,500 words or so per chapter, of what that period was really like as a lived experience.
Just to kind of continue on some of that, we didn't want to write a textbook. There is a market for textbooks. I have bought them and assigned them, and the Bennett Hollister one, or the Hollister Bennett or whatever, is a great example that I've used. And we didn't want to write it for a couple of reasons. One, they often are quite expensive, and we wanted, but I think more importantly is they have a kind of obligation towards coverage. That part of the job of the textbook is to cover as much as possible of the thing it's purporting to cover. And so leaving something out, like say the investiture controversy, without, that would be a bad textbook. But we didn't really, we talked about the investiture controversy, and we just didn't quite have the chapter we wanted to write about it. So it shows up. The investiture controversy for non-medievalists is a long-running conflict between popes and emperors and kings, and that's all I'm going to say about that because we left it out. But I mean, it's important and interesting, and then I tried to do it again when we were writing about Florence in our final chapter, because I wanted to write about Matilda of Tuscany, who is one of the most interesting people in the history of the Middle Ages. She's really the reason that Florence becomes an important political center. When the Pope and Emperor meet, and the Emperor abases himself barefoot in the snow to beg for the Pope Gregory's forgiveness, it's one of the great stories in the Middle Ages. It's happening at this woman Matilda's castle. She set it up. And so I tried to write that story, and Matt said, "David, this is not what the chapter's about." And he was correct, and we cut it, and I'm a little grumpy. But it's because the book is not, it's making an argument about, it's making a number of arguments, but sort of under a master argument about how to talk about and understand and know the medieval European past. And so we really we had and it was tough. We talked about this all the time. We talked about this all the time, and I would have anxiety about things we weren't writing about. And then we would just keep circling back saying, what are we actually trying to do here? What is the work of this book? That said, I hope those of you who teach think about using it in your classroom. I think it'll work in your classroom. If it's coming out in paperback in a year, I think HarperCollins would like people to buy a lot of copies and put it in their classrooms. But it's not a textbook, and I think it's important for us as writers, as teachers, as scholars, to think about the different kind of works that different types of books do, and what this one is.
I will say too, kind of, if I could just add one very brief thing, is that this is the first thing I have ever written across my 16 to 20 year career that my wife has read. So, and didn't fall asleep in the middle of, I should say, too, as well.
Yeah, well, and some of you know this, but if you're in a position to advise University of Minnesota freshmen in the fall, David will be teaching a course called The Bright Ages, and then it has a subtitle, telling stories about.
I don't remember it.
Yeah, anyway, but when I started seeing the Twitter response to this book, and then I read the book, I thought, what could be more fun than reading this book with one of the authors, and what an amazing, wonderful opportunity for freshmen, and it will be fun for David too. So are there, we do have a little bit more time. Are there more questions?
I'm just going to jump in on that so-called Renaissance comment, which I know was
Okay.
Pat
Okay.
said. And in part just because it's a little bit about the stakes here. I'm really, the more, I mean, I've now been working on this particular project for a long time, and then dealing, sort of reacting to the reactions. I mean, just the power of the periodization of medieval and Renaissance, the power of this narrative of the Dark Ages, of a middle period between Rome and Renaissance. I mean, it is really stunning how deep that narrative goes and how important that narrative is to lots of people, both in sort of political contexts or in social contexts, and certainly in academic, that people really have put a lot of weight on that narrative of periodization. And I don't think it holds up. I think it fundamentally doesn't hold up. And even when it does, I mean, it's not that things don't change. But people ask me, well, wouldn't you rather be alive during the Renaissance than during the Middle Ages? And the answer is absolutely not. The Italian Renaissance was a terrible time to live in Italy, unless you were a Medici. If I get to be a Medici, maybe it's okay. But I mean, it was terrible. It was just an awful moment. And we know that because they wrote about it. And there's a letter that we mentioned that was written to Machiavelli. Machiavelli he was writing a history of Florence, and he was going to stop. And I think commander a soldier officer wrote to him saying, no, you have to write it, because otherwise the future generations will never believe how much we lost so quickly. That it was not a happy time in which everyone was making art, right? It was a really difficult time. And I don't know, I guess what I'm hoping to talk about with freshmen and in the book and with you is to think about how we can change these big historical narratives, or at least be really aware of the work that they're doing and think about whether that's work we like and can support.
Yeah. So if I could just add on to that too, but from the other side of our period, it's about this idea of the fall of Rome. And the way that the medievalists and other historians of the ancient or the modern world kind of think about the Middle Ages, like there is a real investment in putting the Middle Ages in the middle, if you will, right? Is that there needs to be, that's one of the things, back to your earlier question, like one of the things about reception that really surprised me was one of the big lines of critique was that we kind of query the idea of the fall of Rome. Not that things didn't change substantially between, the 3rd and the 7th century, but that we're trying to suggest that it's more of a gradual transition, and that you need to think about the different lines of the way people experience the world, right? Not just kind of economic or political, but also cultural and social and religious, and that there are things that are continuous across them. And there has been, I think, not entirely without merit or anything like that, but a sustained kind of voice against kind of this idea that there really was this sharp break, and then there's sometimes like lots of charts and graphs and stuff like that, but about why we're wrong. But again, like I think that's a really interesting kind of discussion point, and one that's absolutely live among medievalists and people who study the ancient world as well, is about like, what is the fall of Rome? What does it mean? How do you move into this thing we call the Middle Ages, or do you move into this thing called the Middle Ages? So
yeah, I have a one thing to say, and then I have a question for you to answer. I mean, what you're really talking about is how do we think about change? I mean, how do we mark change? How do we know that change has happened? And I think that's just a super important question for all things. Barbara Reed wants to know how you write about ordinary life during this period.
Yeah, I can tell you that I mean, there's a lot of good answers that this book does not have as much social history as, I mean, that was a choice that we talked about a lot. We did not do a lot about peasants. I'm a medieval urban historian. My first scholarly publication was on a group of 7 pretty ordinary Venetian merchants. One of them had some connection to some wealth, but still is not someone you would recognize as important, was not, you know, a doge, was not in the elite families, just owned a couple of pieces of property so we can find them. And we also didn't write about that. And that was a harder choice. There are lots of documents. I mean, I think that's really, you know, there's lots of evidence, and there's evidence that's artistic, there's evidence that's material culture, and some amazing work being done across sort of traditional siloed disciplines in terms of people who work with archaeology and do the science with the archaeology, and then people who do other kinds of scholarly research. And then, you know, but then the way my screen's organized is, again, my mentor Kay Ryerson's on the screen, and you know, I think her books have shown that if you just dig into an archive and you read everything from a particular place in time, you can find all kinds of lives that they're there. And that's one of the things that's just so important to us to keep saying, is that these things are knowable. They are there in the sources. You have to ask different kinds of questions sometimes. Sometimes you have to read the sources a little bit sideways. All of my sources are full of lies. They are not, because the people who wrote my sources, they're about relic theft. They are not interested in presenting accurate narratives. That is actually not the function of that text. So when I say lies, they're filled with fictions. They're creating fictions really intentionally. So if you want to know about their lives, well, you can't just assume the thing they write down is the thing that's true, but they did write things down, or they had their local parish priest write things down, and some of them survive. And so I just think, again, maybe less for this community than for others, but people have this idea that there are many things we can't know, but I think there's so much more that it survives, that exists in different kinds of sources if you look for them and you ask different sorts of questions.
Yeah, there's a really good book. I mean, it's a much older book called by Pierre Richer that I've used in the past, called like Daily Life in the 10th Century, and it kind of goes into these kind of everyday questions. And like David was saying, like this just wasn't kind of a focus. Part of the problem, right, is that, like I tell my students in surveys, like nobody ever cares about peasants, right? Like the sources just like they're there to be exploited and stuff like that, because of the way that especially literary or you know, textual production kind of happens in the Middle Ages. It's often by elite people who care about elite things. But every once in a while, like David was saying, and David knows much more about this than I, like a voice kind of comes through, and I'm always reminded, and it just sticks in my head, it sticks in my heart, is this one little moment. It's on page 225 of the book, if you want to look. But we talk in the chapter on the Black Death about Agnolo di Tura, you know, who was a Sienese merchant. I believe he's Sienese. But he talks about the experience of the Black Death. Like he's just kind of like an ordinary merchant, but he talks about how he's buried 5 of his sons with his own hands. Like that's what he writes. And you can feel the experience of fatherhood, of like personhood to him, and how he's living through this pandemic, and how, you know, you could just, that's a moment that just kind of explodes off the page, that as a historian, you have to talk about, you have to show the kind of humanity of these people in the past, and something that we really tried to capture kind of throughout with you know, these little tiny moments across the centuries.
There's a lot of loss. Everyone in our book dies. So I know it's a spoiler, but everyone dies. But there are these interesting moments that I had. It was not intentional. You know, we open our Maimonides chapter with the death of his brother David, who was trying to sail to India, and who dies at sea. And so it's an interesting source in terms of, it gets us, it's the moment where we get into the Indian Ocean, but it's also, you know, Moses mourning the loss of David, and he writes about it and survives. Or even at the end of the very first chapter on Galla Placidia, this empress, she is taken as kind of a prisoner of war, and then enters into a diplomatic marriage, and then moves to Spain, has a baby, the baby dies, her husband dies, she moves back to Italy, and her story continues from there. But there's this baby that died. And then when she herself dies in Rome, but she wasn't planning on, she didn't go to Rome to die. She went to Rome to talk to the Pope. When she herself dies in Rome, she's buried there, and she's buried next to a silver casket with her son. And I so I don't know, has she been carrying this casket with her everywhere she goes for decades? It's possible. Was it just stored in Rome? It's possible. I don't know, but I do know that we shouldn't, like, that it matters, right? That it matters that this mother whose child died in infancy, that she was buried next to this casket, and that it matters, and that it's part of the story we need to tell.
I really do hate to bring this to an end, but I think that if you're to get to your next appointment, we probably need to do that. I'm on the library board. It's not exciting, but it's good civic duty for Ramsey County libraries.
Yeah.
So and there's no transportation time because everything is virtual. Yeah. And yet one can't really do 2 Zooms at once. Although sometimes I think one is tempted to. So thank you so much. This has been fun. I loved the book. I really loved the book. I listened to it too, and it's I think it's fabulous, and it's really inspiring. So the Ramsey County Historical Society is now responding. So Clayton, do we always save the chat?
Yes.
Okay, so all of the wonderful things that people are saying about you will be saved in a chat that Clayton can send you. And I noticed that there were some people who wandered in just a couple of minutes ago, probably not understanding that we were actually meeting at a different time. To mitigate the tragedy of your having missed this wonderful talk, it is recorded, and we'll be circulating the link. Clayton will send a thank you note in the tomorrow, and if you are moved to contribute to the University of Minnesota Department of History, that would be welcome. And actually, since David is the undergraduate advisor, if you would be moved to contribute and want to earmark your contributions to undergraduate students, I'm sure Clayton can figure out how to deal with that. Clayton, I mean, not only is Clayton a wonderful development officer, but this whole series of book talks was actually his idea of bringing people together in community, doing something interesting during a time when we can't hang out in normal ways. And it's been so wonderful in bringing large audiences and audiences from far-flung places, that when it's perfectly safe to be in the same room, we'll still do it this way. Though we might take the speakers out afterwards. So anyway, thanks a lot, and
thanks everyone.
The next talk, I believe the next talk is Emily Rook-Kepsel, and I think Patricia Lorsan will be talking. And I don't have the title of Emily's book in front of me. Do you have it in front of you, Clayton?
Yep. It is Democracy and Unity in India, Understanding the All India Phenomenon 1940 to 1960.
And that's
on March 16th.
March 16th, it's exactly a month from now. So Emily Rook-Kepsel and Patricia Lorsan talking about India. I'm sure it will be great. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.